there comes a moment when you start to notice something subtle but undeniable. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. It feels like the world is finally beginning to see you in a way it never did before. And the strangest part, nothing about you changed overnight. You've been putting in the work for a long time, quietly. You've been showing up, even when no one was watching. You've been carrying weight that nobody ever acknowledged. So why now? Why does it suddenly feel like your efforts are finally being recognized? Because something deeper has been shifting, long before anyone else noticed. There was a time when you felt invisible, like no matter how much effort you gave, it went unnoticed. Like your growth didn't matter. Like your silence was mistaken for weakness. But what you didn't realize in those moments was that you were building something internal, something solid, something real. You were learning how to stand on your own without validation. And that changes everything, because recognition doesn't begin outside. It begins the moment you stop needing it. Think about how much you've changed. The way you handle situations now is different. The way you think is deeper. You pause more. You reflect more. You no longer react the way you used to. And maybe people around you haven't said it directly, but they feel it. There's a shift in your presence, a calmness, a quiet confidence. You're not trying to prove anything anymore. And that's exactly what makes you stand out. Because most people are still chasing approval, still trying to be seen, still trying to be heard. But you've stepped into something else. You've started understanding yourself. And when that happens, something powerful unfolds. You stop forcing things. You stop chasing people. You stop explaining your worth. And slowly, without you even realizing it, the right kind of attention begins to find you. Not because you demanded it, but because you became aligned with who you truly are. This is the part no one talks about. Recognition doesn't always come as applause. Sometimes it shows up as respect, as space, as people taking you more seriously, as opportunities opening in subtle ways, as conversations that suddenly feel different. And sometimes it shows up as people who once overlooked you, now paying attention. But here's the truth you need to hold on to. This isn't about them finally seeing you. This is about you finally seeing yourself. Because the moment you started valuing your own growth, the moment you stopped settling for who you used to be, the moment you chose awareness over comfort, everything began to shift. Even if it felt slow, even if it felt unnoticed, even if it felt lonely at times. Growth often feels like isolation before it feels like elevation. You outgrow environments. You outgrow conversations. You even outgrow versions of yourself that once felt familiar. And that can feel uncomfortable. But it's also necessary. Because you can't become who you're meant to be by staying who you were. And now you're starting to see the results. Not in a loud, overwhelming way, but in a grounded, steady way. You feel more clear, more aware, more in control of your direction. And people are starting to respond to that. But don't let this moment distract you. Don't let recognition become the goal. Let growth remain the focus. Because the truth is, the more you grow, the less you'll need to be recognized. And ironically, that's when it comes naturally. So if you've been feeling this shift, if you've been sensing that something is changing, trust it, not as a promise of something external, but as proof of something internal. You're evolving. You're becoming more aware, more intentional, more aligned with your true self. And that matters more than any validation ever could. Take a moment and reflect on how far you've come. Not just in what you've achieved, but in how you've changed. Because that's the real progress. That's the real transformation. And that's what no one can take away from you. If this message resonated with you, take a second to pause and really think about your journey. What have you learned about yourself? And where are you choosing to go next? Share your thoughts below. And if you're on this path of self-awareness and growth, stay connected with Return to Awakening. Because this journey, it's not about becoming someone else. It's about finally understanding who you've been all along. And there's another layer to this, something even quieter. You're no longer seeking the same things you once did. The things that used to excite you don't hold the same weight anymore. The noise that once pulled your attention now feels distant, almost irrelevant. And at first, that shift can feel confusing. You start questioning yourself. Why don't I feel the same anymore? Why do I feel disconnected from things I once cared about? But this isn't loss. This is refinement. You're not losing yourself. You're shedding what no longer aligns with who you're becoming. And that process, it's not always comfortable. Because growth doesn't just add to your life. It removes. It clears. It creates space. Space for clarity. Space for truth. Space for a version of you that isn't driven by pressure, but by purpose. You begin to notice patterns more clearly. In people. In conversations. In your own thoughts. You start seeing what's genuine and what's forced. What's meaningful and what's empty. And that awareness changes how you move. You become more intentional. More selective. Not out of ego, but out of understanding. Because your energy is no longer something you give away easily. You've learned how valuable it is. And that alone is a form of recognition. Not from the world, but from within. There was a time when you would tolerated things just to feel included. You would stayed silent just to keep the peace. You would ignored your own instincts just to avoid standing out. But now, something inside you refuses to go back to that version. You can feel it. A quiet resistance. A deeper voice that says, this isn't for you anymore. And you listen. Not perfectly, but more than you ever have before. That's growth. Not perfection. Not having everything figured out. But choosing awareness, even when it's uncomfortable. Choosing honesty, even when it's easier to pretend. Choosing yourself, even when it means walking a path that others don't fully understand. And yes, that path can feel lonely at times. Because not everyone will relate to the version of you that's evolving. Some people only knew the old you. The one who stayed quiet. The one who fit in. The one who didn't question things. So when you begin to change, it can create distance. Not because you're better, but because you're different now. And that difference, it matters. It's a sign that you're no longer moving unconsciously. You're becoming aware of your choices, your patterns, your direction. And that awareness, it's something most people avoid. Because it requires responsibility. It requires facing parts of yourself that are uncomfortable. It requires letting go of illusions you once believed in. But you didn't run from it. Even when it felt heavy. Even when it felt overwhelming. You stayed with it. You faced it. And slowly, piece by piece, you began rebuilding yourself. Not based on expectations. Not based on approval. But based on truth. Your truth. And that's why things are changing now. Not because something magical suddenly happened, but because you've been doing the internal work that most people never see. The kind of work that doesn't get applause. The kind of work that doesn't get recognized immediately. But it shapes everything. It shapes how you think, how you speak, how you carry yourself. And eventually, it shapes how the world responds to you. Because people can feel authenticity. They can sense when someone is grounded versus when someone is pretending. And you've stepped into something real, something steady, something that doesn't need to be announced to be understood. That's why the recognition feels different now. It's not overwhelming. It's not chaotic. It's subtle, respectful, earned, and maybe for the first time, you're not surprised by it. Because deep down, you know what it took to become this version of yourself, and even now, you're still evolving. This isn't the final version of you. It never was. Growth doesn't arrive as a destination. It moves with you. It reshapes you again and again. That's why there are moments where you feel completely clear, and then moments where everything feels uncertain again. But that doesn't mean you're going backwards. It means you're going deeper. Because every new level of awareness reveals something you couldn't see before. New questions, new realizations, new truths. And sometimes that can feel heavy. Because the more aware you become, the harder it is to ignore what doesn't feel right anymore. You notice misalignment faster. You feel when something is off, even if you can't explain it. And that sensitivity, it's not a weakness. It's a sign that you're becoming more in tune with yourself, more honest with what you feel, more aware of what you need. But here's the part that challenges most people. With awareness comes responsibility. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you now understand. So the choices you make from here, they matter more. You start holding yourself to a higher standard. Not out of pressure, but out of respect for who you're becoming. You no longer ignore your own boundaries. You no longer betray your own instincts, even in small ways. And that changes how you show up in the world. There's a quiet discipline forming within you. Not forced, not rigid, but natural. You begin to choose what aligns over what's easy. You begin to walk away instead of holding on. You begin to speak with intention instead of reacting from emotion. And people notice that, even if they don't say it out loud. Because most people are used to inconsistency. They're used to people who say one thing and do another. But when someone becomes aligned within themselves, it stands out. There's a stability to it, a grounded presence. And that presence, it carries weight. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to chase attention to be seen. There's something about the way you move now that naturally draws respect. And it didn't come from trying to impress anyone. It came from doing the internal work, the kind that forced you to sit with yourself, to question yourself, to understand yourself on a deeper level. And that's why you're no longer easily shaken. Things that once triggered you don't have the same power. Situations that once overwhelmed you now feel manageable. Not because life got easier, but because you became stronger, more aware, more centered. And that's a form of recognition most people overlook. You've become someone who can handle more, who can see more clearly, who can respond instead of react. And that shift, it changes everything. Because life will always have challenges. But the way you meet those challenges, that's what defines your experience. And now, you're meeting them differently. With patience, with awareness, with a sense of control that doesn't come from forcing outcomes, but from understanding yourself. And there's something else you might be noticing. You're starting to trust yourself more. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but more than before. You're beginning to rely on your own judgment, your own perspective, your own inner voice. And that trust, it's powerful, because once you start trusting yourself, you stop looking outside for constant direction. You stop depending on others to validate your decisions. You begin to move with a sense of quiet certainty. Not arrogance, not ego, just a grounded knowing. And that's rare. That's something most people are still searching for. But you've been building it, step by step, through every experience, every mistake, every moment where you chose to reflect instead of escape. That's where this version of you was formed. Not in comfort, but in awareness. Not in ease, but in honesty. And now it's showing. In ways you didn't expect. In ways you didn't plan. But in ways that feel real. And what's even more profound is how you're starting to experience silence differently. Before, silence felt uncomfortable. It made you overthink. It made you question everything. But now, silence feels like clarity. Like a space where you can finally hear yourself. No noise. No pressure. Just awareness. And in that space, you're beginning to understand things about yourself that were always there. But buried. Buried under expectations. Buried under distractions. Buried under the need to keep up with everything and everyone around you. Now, you're not rushing the process anymore. You're allowing things to unfold. You're allowing yourself to feel, without immediately trying to fix or escape it. And that's a different kind of strength. Because most people run from discomfort. Most people distract themselves the moment things get too real. But you stayed, even when it felt unfamiliar, even when it felt uncertain. You stayed present with your own thoughts, your own emotions. And that presence, it's changing you. You're no longer reacting out of habit. You're responding with awareness. You take a moment. You think. You choose. And those small pauses, they're shaping a completely different life for you. Because your life is not just built on big decisions. It's built on the small ones. The quiet ones. The ones no one sees. And you've started mastering those moments. That's why things feel different now. Not perfect. Not flawless. But intentional. And intention creates direction. Direction creates clarity. And clarity, it removes confusion. You're no longer lost in the same way. You might not have all the answers, but you're no longer disconnected from yourself. And that alone is a powerful shift. You're starting to recognize your own patterns. The way you think under pressure. The way you respond to uncertainty. The way you either hold on or let go. And instead of judging yourself for it, you're observing it, learning from it, adjusting. That's real growth. Not pretending to have it all together, but being honest about where you are and choosing to improve without tearing yourself down. There's also a deeper sense of patience forming within you. You're not in a rush like you used to be. You're not chasing outcomes just to feel accomplished. You're understanding that real change takes time. That alignment isn't instant. That clarity is built, not found. And because of that, you're moving differently. More grounded. More steady. Less reactive. And that energy, it influences everything around you. The way people speak to you. The way they respond to you. Even the kind of opportunities that come your way. Because when your internal state changes, Your external experience begins to reflect it, not in a magical or instant way, but in a natural cause and effect way. You make better decisions. You avoid situations that drain you. You choose environments that support your growth. And over time, that compounds, that builds, that transforms your life in ways that once felt out of reach. And maybe you're starting to notice something else too. You're becoming more comfortable being alone. Not isolated, not disconnected, but at peace with your own company. You no longer need constant distraction. You no longer fear being by yourself, because you've built a relationship with yourself that feels stable, real, honest, and that's rare, because many people spend their entire lives avoiding that relationship, avoiding themselves. But you faced it. You sat with it. You worked through it. And now, you're no longer searching for yourself in everything around you. You're finding yourself within. And that changes how you connect with the world. You're no longer trying to fill a gap. You're no longer looking for something to complete you. You're showing up as someone who is already whole and still growing. And that kind of presence, it doesn't need validation to exist. It doesn't need constant recognition to feel real. Because it's built on something deeper, something internal, something that no one else can give you and no one can take away. And because of that, your standards begin to shift in ways you didn't expect. Not just for others, but for yourself. You start noticing what you allow and what you no longer tolerate. Not out of pride, not out of ego, but out of clarity. You've seen what it feels like to ignore your own boundaries. You've experienced what happens when you silence your instincts. And now, there's a quiet refusal within you to go back to that. So you choose differently. Even when it's hard. Even when it means disappointing someone. Even when it means standing alone for a while. Because deep down, you understand something most people struggle to accept. Not everything is meant to stay. Not every connection is meant to grow with you. Not every environment is meant to support who you're becoming. And that realization, it can feel heavy at first. Because letting go isn't easy. Even when you know it's necessary. But you're starting to see it from a different perspective now. You're not losing things. You're creating alignment. You're making space for something that actually matches your growth. And that requires courage. The kind of courage that doesn't always look strong on the outside, but feels steady on the inside. You're also becoming more aware of your time. How you spend it. Who you give it to. What you invest your energy into. And that awareness changes your priorities. You're no longer pouring yourself into things that don't pour back into you. You're no longer chasing moments that leave you feeling empty afterward. You're choosing depth over distraction, meaning over noise. And that choice, it separates you. Not in a way that isolates you, but in a way that refines your path. Because not everyone is willing to make that shift. Not everyone is ready to be that honest with themselves. But you were, even when it was uncomfortable. Even when it required you to face things you once avoided. And that's why you're here now. In this space of awareness. In this phase of quiet transformation. Where things are no longer chaotic, but they're not fully clear either. And that in-between space. It's important. It's where integration happens. It's where everything you've learned begins to settle. To become part of who you are, not just something you understand. You're not rushing through it anymore. You're allowing it to shape you. Slowly. Naturally. And that patience, it's building something deeper than quick results ever could. Because fast change can fade. But grounded change, it stays. It becomes part of your identity. The way you think, the way you respond, the way you move through life. And that's what's happening right now. You're not just changing your circumstances. You're changing your foundation. And when your foundation changes, everything built on top of it begins to shift too. Your decisions become clearer. Your direction becomes stronger. Your sense of self becomes more stable. And with that stability comes a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, but quiet, unshaken. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are anymore. You don't need to explain your growth to people who don't understand it. Because you've lived it. You've felt it. You've earned it. And that's enough. There's a sense of inner peace starting to form within you. Not constant, not perfect, but present. Moments where you feel aligned. Moments where you feel grounded. Moments where you realize you're no longer who you used to be. And instead of fearing that change, you're beginning to accept it, even appreciate it, because you know what it took to get here. The confusion, the doubt, the moments where you questioned everything. But you didn't stop. You kept going. You kept reflecting. You kept choosing growth, even when it felt slow. And now, you're standing in a version of yourself that once felt far away. Not perfect, but real. Not finished, but aware. And that awareness, it's guiding you forward. Step by step. Decision by decision. Without the need to rush. Without the need to prove anything. Just a quiet, steady movement toward becoming more of who you already are. And somewhere along this path, you stopped comparing yourself the way you used to. You're no longer measuring your progress against someone else's timeline. You're no longer questioning your worth based on what others have achieved. Because you've started to understand something deeper. Everyone is moving through a different experience. Different challenges. Different lessons. Different timing. And once that realization settles in, comparison begins to lose its grip on you. You start focusing inward, on your own growth, your own direction, your own pace. And that shift, it brings a kind of freedom, a quiet release from pressure you didn't even realize you were carrying. You're not trying to keep up anymore. You're not trying to fit into paths that were never meant for you. You're walking your own path now, even if it's unclear at times, even if it's slower than expected, because it feels real. It feels aligned, and that matters more than speed ever could. You're also becoming more honest with yourself in ways that require real courage. You're no longer hiding behind excuses. You're no longer avoiding the truth when something doesn't feel right. You're facing it, acknowledging it, even when it's uncomfortable. And that honesty, it's refining you. It's shaping your decisions. It's guiding your next steps. Because when you're honest with yourself, you stop making choices that take you further away from who you are. You start making choices that bring you closer. And sometimes those choices are difficult. Walking away, starting over, letting go of what's familiar, choosing discipline over comfort, choosing growth over ease. But you're doing it anyway. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And that intention, it's building momentum. Slowly, steadily, in ways that might not be obvious day to day, but become undeniable over time. There's also a deeper emotional strength forming within you. Not the kind that avoids feeling, but the kind that allows it without being controlled by it. You're learning how to sit with your emotions, without letting them define your actions. You're learning how to feel deeply and still move forward. In that balance, it's powerful because you're no longer suppressing what you feel, but you're also not losing yourself in it. You're understanding it, processing it, growing through it, and that changes how you experience everything. Challenges don't break you the same way anymore. They teach you. They reveal something. They push you to look deeper. And instead of resisting that, you're starting to lean into it. You're starting to trust that even difficult moments have something to show you. Not as a guarantee, not as a perfect system, but as part of the process of becoming more aware, more resilient, more grounded. And as you move through this, you might notice something unexpected. You're becoming less reactive to opinions, less affected by how others perceive you. Not because you don't care at all, but because you're no longer defined by it. You've spent time understanding who you are, what you value, what matters to you, and that internal clarity. It reduces the need for external approval. You're not easily swayed anymore, not easily shaken, because your sense of self isn't built on unstable ground. It's built on experience, reflection, growth, and that foundation it holds. Even when things around you feel uncertain, even when situations don't go as planned, even when life challenges you in ways you didn't expect, you return to yourself. You pause, you reflect, you adjust, and then you move forward. Not blindly, but consciously. And that's the difference now. You're no longer just reacting to life. You're engaging with it, understanding it, learning from it, and shaping your path through it with intention. And the more you move like this, the more you start to notice a quiet shift in how life meets you. Situations that once felt complicated begin to feel clearer. Not because everything suddenly becomes easy, but because you're no longer adding confusion to it. You see things for what they are, without overanalyzing, without forcing meaning where there isn't any. And that clarity, it saves you. It saves your energy, your time, your peace. You're no longer pulled into every distraction. You're no longer reacting to every emotion that passes through you. You've learned how to pause, to observe, to choose your response. And that pause, it creates space. Space between what happens and how you respond to it. And in that space, you found control. Not over everything in life, but over yourself. And that's where real power begins. Because when you can manage your own reactions, you stop feeling like everything outside of you is in control. You stop feeling like life is just happening to you. You start realizing you have influence. Through your perspective, through your choices, through the way you carry yourself. And that realization changes everything. You become less reactive to chaos, less affected by negativity, less attached to outcomes you can't control, and more focused on what you can. Your actions, your mindset, your direction. And that focus, it builds stability, even in uncertain situations. Even when things don't go the way you planned. You don't fall apart the way you used to. You adjust. You recalibrate. You keep moving. Because you understand something now. Life isn't about controlling every outcome. It's about learning how to navigate whatever comes. And you've been practicing that. Through every challenge, every setback, every moment where things didn't go your way. You didn't realize it at the time, but those moments were shaping you, strengthening you, expanding your perspective. And now, you're able to handle things with a level of calm you didn't have before. There's less urgency in you, less need to rush, less need to force things into place. You're allowing things to unfold, while still taking responsibility for your actions. And that balance, it's rare, because most people are either trying to control everything or avoiding responsibility altogether. But you've found something in between, a grounded way of moving forward, with intention, with awareness, with patience. And that patience is starting to show its value, because things that once felt delayed now feel like they arrived at the right time. Conversations that once didn't make sense now feel clearer. Decisions that once felt confusing now feel obvious, not because the world changed overnight, but because you did. You've developed a different lens, a different way of seeing, and that perspective, it guides you, even when things aren't fully clear, even when you don't have all the answers. You trust the process a little more now, not blindly, not without question, but with a sense of understanding that growth takes time, that clarity comes in layers, that not everything is meant to be figured out instantly. And that understanding, it keeps you grounded. It keeps you moving, without the pressure to have everything perfectly aligned. You're becoming comfortable with progress instead of perfection, with movement instead of control, with awareness instead of reaction. And that shift, it's shaping a life that feels more real, more intentional, more aligned with who you are becoming. And even if it's not fully visible yet, even if the results aren't loud or obvious, you can feel it. Something is changing. Something is settling into place. Not externally at first, but internally. And that's where it always begins.